Places in America where the road goes quiet, where legends still breathe, and where the line between truth and folklore blurs. From haunted highways and cryptid sightings to stories that have echoed through generations, State of the Unknown takes you deep into the shadows of America's strangest corners. Hosted by Rob, this documentary-style podcast blends immersive storytelling with real research to uncover the tales that refuse to fade. If you like your mysteries murky and your folklore just a little too real, you might already be living in the state of the unknown. Listen now wherever you get your podcasts.
Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that Down the Crooked Path is researched and recorded in Niagara Falls, Ontario, on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Attawandaron, and the Mississauga of Credit First. This land has been home to Indigenous peoples for thousands of years, and we recognize their enduring connection. We are grateful to share these stories on their lands that carry their histories, and we encourage our listeners to reflect on the past, present, and future of the land they call home. Welcome, wanderers, to Journey Down the Crooked Path, a place where the stories are stranger, the shadows stretch longer, and the things that go bump in the night might just be listening. I'm Amanda Joy, your guide into the eerie, the forgotten, and the downright bizarre. Here, we step off the well-lit roads of Canadian creepies and venture into the murky corners of history, folklore, and the unexplained, where the whispers grow louder and the truth is never quite what it seems. So let's take a deep breath, watch your step, and whatever you do, don't look back. Once you start down the crooked path, you never know what might follow.
It might start with something falling, like the wind blowing an item off a table, a frame falling off the wall maybe, a spoon perhaps. Something small enough to be dismissed, but loud enough to be noticed. And then maybe you might notice a flickering of the lights. The dog starts to avoid certain areas of the home. And the children say that someone, or perhaps something, is whispering in their ears at night. You check all the mundane sources, the fuse box or a drafty window. You start to check your memory. But there's something about the place that now feels off. Not haunted or full of ghosts, but more like the house itself is angry. The word poltergeist is a word that has been stretched thin by movies and headlines, but it's much older than Hollywood. A poltergeist is not a spirit in the traditional sense. It's an eruption of energy that is disruptive and enraged. It is the violence of the space itself. Unlike a traditional haunting, which are often associated with apparitions or residual energy, poltergeist phenomenon is characterized by kinetic activity, objects moving, electrical interferences, and in some cases, physical harm. These events are often reoccurrent, localized, and escalate over time. In some parapsychological literature, poltergeists can often be linked to unconscious psychokinetic activity, particularly in adolescents under emotional stress. The term poltergeist originates from Germany, meaning noisy spirit, and in a small town in Ontario, there is a poltergeist story that was one of the loudest cases ever recorded. In the autumn of 1889, the Dagg family moved into a modest farmstead near Calderon, Ontario, a rural stretch of Renfrew County where the land was quiet and the nights were long. The house stood near the edge of a clearing surrounded by thick woods that pressed in from all sides. John and Susan Dagg had settled there with their children, carving out a life for themselves. The house was built plain, a single chimney and a narrow porch, and the barn leaning slightly to one side, its boards weathered from years of sun and snow. There were neighbors, but not many. The towns closest were a few miles off, and the roads that led there were mostly dirt and stone, winding past fields and strands of pines. The Daggs were known in the area for being steady and hard-working. They kept livestock, tended crops, and raised their children. Living with them at the time was Dinah, a young girl that they had adopted. She helped with chores and spent most of her time in the house. The house was full, but not crowded. It was the kind of place where the days passed in routine and the nights were quiet enough to hear the wind move through the trees. And then, without warning, that quiet began to shift and change. September, when the first signs appeared, the mornings had started to grow colder, and the light came in low through the windows, casting long shadows across the floorboards. One of the children found it first. Animal feces smeared across the kitchen floor. Thick, wet, and unmistakable. The smell settled into the walls. John cleaned it without speaking while Susan opened the windows. But no one knew how it had gotten there. They kept livestock, but not inside. The barn doors were closed. It didn't make any sense. A boy from the area had been helping with chores, and for a time, suspicion fell onto him. He was young and quiet, and not well known to the family. But the smears returned even when he wasn't there. They'd show up in the morning in places that had been cleaned and emptied before bed. Sometimes near the stove, sometimes in the hallway. Dinah said that she could hear something in the night, and when asked to explain, she simply couldn't. Next came the noises, knocking that came from inside the wall, scratches that moved across the ceiling, sounds that didn't belong to footsteps, or the wind, or the settling of wood. Daylight, or after dusk, it didn't matter. Soon after that, objects started to move on their own. A butter tub lifted from the counter and landed hard against the floor. A cream pitcher slid across the table and tipped over without anyone near it. A jug of water flew through the air and struck Mrs. Dagg in the face. It had been sitting on a shelf, and she was alone in the room. As the situation escalated, fires started to break out. One day, 8 separate blazes broke out, 6 inside the house and 2 outside. They'd start in corners, on the folds of fabric, in places where no flame had been lit. The family would put them out with buckets and blankets, hands burned, eyes stinging. The rooms held the smell of smoke for days, and the walls held the heat. The floorboards had been blackened in places, but no cause for the fires were ever found. It wasn't long before attention turned to Dinah. She started to speak about being pushed, but no one was around her. Scratches appeared on her arms. Once she was slapped across the face, though no one was close enough to touch her. One morning, she was found on the parlor floor, dragged out of her chair by the hem of her dress, which was now torn, and she had scrapes on her hands, bloody and raw. She started to spend more time in the woodshed, and the others began to notice that something felt odd about that. She stayed there by herself for long periods of time, and when they listened from the yard, they could hear her talking to something or someone. Her voice was clear, but then there was another voice answering her. It was deep and gruff, and it mocked her. Witness described it as neither male nor female, and they said it carried something cruel in its tone, and it laughed at her. When asked who she was talking to, she said it was a man, tall and thin, but that he had the head of a cow and horns that curled from the back of his skull. She said that he had hooves instead of feet and eyes that didn't blink. It was at this point that the Daggs sought help. Word sped through Calderon and the surrounding farms, and neighbors came to witness what they couldn't explain. Some brought scriptures, others brought salt. A few came with stories of their own passed down from older generations, and offered rituals meant to quiet the house. Reverend Mr. Bell, a local Methodist minister, arrived with a Bible and a calm voice. He read aloud in the parlor while the children sat nearby. The pages turned without wind. The voice returned louder than before and interrupted the reading with curses. It called the minister a fool, and it laughed when he prayed. Another clergyman, Reverend Mr. Horsey, came from a nearby parish and stayed overnight. He recorded what he saw and heard, noting the movement of the objects and the voices that spoke from empty rooms. He tried blessings, laying hands on the walls and speaking in firm tones. The voice mocked him by name. It repeated his words back to him, twisted and sharp. Folk practitioners in the area came with herbs and smoke, walking the perimeter of the house and marking the doorframe. But the activity didn't stop. The fires still sparked, furniture shifted. Dinah was struck across the back while standing in the kitchen. The entity made threats, clear and direct. It said it wouldn't leave. At one point, the voice shifted in tone. This time it claimed to be the devil, declaring, "I am the devil, and I'll have you in my clutches." It said that it had lived in the house for 100 years. And at one point, it also claimed to be a man who had died 20 years earlier. It would give names and dates and change tone mid-sentences, sometimes speaking in a low growl, other times in a high, clear voice that sounded like a child. Witnesses described it as cruel, deliberate, and unshaken by prayer. It answered questions before they were finished. It repeated private thoughts out loud. It spoke in English, but once used a word that nobody recognized. Neighbors came and went, some stayed, some for hours, some overnight. Between September 15th and November 17th, 1889, a group of witnesses signed sworn affidavits. The documents were written by hand and carried the names of farmers, tradesmen, and clergy. One of them stated that the phenomenon was real and had occurred as described. The accounts included the fires, 8 in one day, 6 inside, 2 out, the jars being thrown across rooms, the scratches that appeared on Dinah's arms, and the voice that spoke without a mouth. Then one day the unspeakable happened. In late 1889, a fire broke out within the home, fast and without warning. The rooms filled with billowy black smoke, thick and choking. The curtains burned while they still hung in the windows. Furniture caught fire without explanation. And in the chaos, Susan, the Daggs' 4-year-old daughter, was trapped. Despite the attempts of Mrs. Dagg and the neighbors, the fire was too large and spread too quickly, and Susan couldn't be saved in time. There are other versions of this story that say witnesses saw Susan dragged into the fire by her ankles by something that could not be seen by the naked eye. But regardless of what actually had happened, the community blamed Dinah for Susan's death. After all, she had been at the heart of these disturbances. A few neighbors claimed that she had called the fire down as she spoke with the entity behind the woodshed. With the family still reeling from the tragic loss of their daughter, the poltergeist didn't relent. It continued to berate the family with torment, taunts, and insults that were more malicious than before, more specific. This time it would make a chilling threat. In a deep, gruff, and unearthly voice, it claimed, "I'll take the boy next."
You. Yeah, you. Still haunting the same old fast fashion? Time to dig up something better with Back from the Dead Goods, a Canadian small business where forgotten threads get a second life and sustainability meets spooky. This isn't just upcycled clothing. It's resurrected fashion with an eerie edge. Handpicked, reworked, and revived, every piece is as unique as a ghost story whispered at midnight. And because you're a part of the Canadian Creepies family, you get an exclusive deal. Use code Canadian Creepies at checkout for 10% off. Find them lurking on Instagram, Etsy, and Poshmark. Links are in the episode description. Give your wardrobe a second chance at life, if you dare. Once upon a time, in the land of everyday moments, there lived a sprinkle of magic called icing sugar photography. From sticky cake smash smiles to wind-swept yes moments, they capture the sugar sweet, the beautifully messy, and everything in between. Whether you're a blushing bride or a blooming family, or just want to freeze time for a second, icing sugar photography is your fairy god lens. Visit icingsugarphotography.com and follow along on Instagram at icingsugarphoto. Let your story sparkle, because life is sweet and memories should be too. Looking for your next obsession? The Creators Collective Podcasts is your gateway to the dark, the chilling, and the downright fascinating. We're a community of independent podcasts with one goal: to share the best in true crime, paranormal tales, folklore, and unexplained mysteries. Whether you crave cold cases that won't stay closed, haunted histories that refuse to be forgotten, or stories that make you sleep with the lights on, there's a show waiting for you in the collective. And when you join us, you're not just listening to one podcast. You're stepping into a world of creators who love this stuff as much as you do. Check out the Creators Collective today. Follow the link in our show notes to discover your next favorite podcast. We'll be waiting for you.
Percy Woodcock arrived in Calderon in November of 1889. He was a journalist from Ottawa known for covering unusual cases and willing to stay where others wouldn't. He brought notebooks, ink, and a willingness to listen. He stayed at the Dagg home for several days, observing the family and recording the disturbances. Speaking with witnesses, for example, he interviewed Reverend Horsey and reviewed the signed affidavits. He published his findings in a series of articles stating that the events were real and that the witnesses were all credible. Because of this, his work became one of the primary sources for later investigations. Published in the Brockville Recorder and Times, and later cited in multiple historical summaries, Woodcock wrote, "Are you there, mister?" Dinah called once they reached the shed. To Woodcock's astonishment, a gruff male voice growled, "I am the devil. I'll have you in my clutches. Get out of here or I'll break your neck." Woodcock responded by chastising the voice for using foul language in front of a child. The entity replied with a torrent of curses. After Percy Woodcock left Calderon, the house didn't settle. The voice returned with force. It threatened to burn down the barn, and Dinah was repeatedly abused, often being struck in front of her mother. Chairs would lift and drop without warning. In desperation, the family decided to hold a prayer vigil late November. Those neighbors who had stayed through the worst of it pulled chairs into the parlor and lit lamps. Scriptures were open, and just as dusk began, they started to read aloud in shifts, moving from room to room, speaking over each other, calling out in voices that cracked from overuse. After hours of continuous prayer, the entity's voice faded into a whisper, and then ceased entirely. What followed was described by multiple witnesses as a burst of light near the ceiling, accompanied by a musical tone or singing that grew fainter as the light moved upward and then vanished. After this, the disturbances stopped completely. No more random fires or haunting voices from the woodshed. Objects remained in place. But for Dinah, the damage was done, and the family looked at her differently. The house had gone quiet, but the weight of what had happened didn't lift. And so for Dinah, she was sent away not long after the vigil. George Dagg arranged for her to live with his father, miles away from Calderon. She left without protest and a small bundle of clothing. It wasn't framed as a punishment, but nobody missed the timing. For a long time, she stayed with George's father, and then she was later placed at the Fair Knoll home in Brockville. The records listed her name, age, and date she arrived. She didn't talk much, and she didn't mention Calderon. She was assigned work on a nearby farm when she turned 15. The family took her in, said that she kept to herself, she didn't cause trouble, and she didn't stay long. One night, a man came to the farm and asked for Dinah by name. They spoke alone for some time, and no one saw either of them leave. Dinah's things were left in her room and her bed was made, but she was never seen again. The home marked her case as closed, and the Daggs didn't go looking for her either. There were never any marriage or burial records associated with her name. She just vanished. This isn't where our story ends. Some years later, John Dagg enlisted in the Great War. He was older than most of the boys who signed up from Calderon. The records show that he joined the Canadian Expeditionary Forces and was deployed overseas. Letters came for a time, but then they stopped. John Dagg was listed as killed in action, most likely in a battle near Passchendaele, and his body was never recovered. There are some that remembered the voice and what it had once said. "I'll take the boy next." After the events stopped at the Dagg farm, most tried to move on and forget the horrible things the voice had said, had once threatened. But after John died, the story returned. What if his death was a prophecy fulfilled? The voice had stopped speaking long ago, but John never came home. The fires are out, the Daggs are all buried, and the affidavits sit in archives collecting dust. Despite this, there are questions that have never been answered. If the voices only spoke when Dinah was near, was it haunting the house or haunting her? By most accounts, a poltergeist isn't a ghost. They don't care about your home. It doesn't float down hallways or whisper in Latin. They break glass and set fires. They bite and pinch and say horrible things. And usually it shows up around children. Not always, but often young girls who are stressed. There is a theory that poltergeists are created by these individuals through psychokinetics, uncontrolled, unconscious energy. There have been cases in which this idea has been explored. Rosenheim, Inkfield, the Bell Witch, Columbus. And in all of these cases, the same pattern seems to be followed. A young person, a volatile environment, objects moving without contact, and a sound with no source. In Calderon, Dinah was at the center. It spoke to her. It struck her, followed her. Before settling with the Daggs, Dinah had been moved around, home to home, since the age of 4. She wasn't exactly family, and she didn't have her own room. In short, she never really had stability. And then everything stopped when she went away. If psychokinetic theory is real, then she fits the profile. Now, this theory doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain how the voice had knowledge of local death or gossip. It doesn't explain the man who came for Dinah. But it does explain the timing. It explains the escalation. It explains why the house stayed quiet after she left, and why no one else heard that voice again. And that's the story of the Dagg Poltergeist, one of Canada's most disturbing and well-documented hauntings. A family torn apart, a child lost in a fire, and a voice that claimed to be both devil and man. Whether you believe it was supernatural, psychological, or something in between, the impact was very real, and it has left behind questions that still haven't been answered. Was this a one-time event, or will there be other cases, other families who will face something as strange and fearsome? Until then, what do you think, dear listener? Are poltergeists a reflection of human trauma, or something older and far less human?